The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked back to the house after my father's funeral. The September air in Denver bit at my skin, but it didn't chill the anger simmering in my chest. My brothers, Jake and Chris, had already scattered like vultures, too busy mocking me to stay for the eulogy. Still living in the old man's house, Mark. You're 54, not a college student, Jake had sneered, taking a swig from his beer. Chris nodded, eyes flicking to the sagging porch of the home we'd grown up in. I said nothing. I didn't answer. Let them think I was powerless. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments section where you are listening from. My name is Mark Reynolds, I'm 54 years old. Growing up in Denver as the youngest of 3 boys meant I was always trailing behind, trying to keep up with Richard and James, trying to impress them, trying to belong. They were the achievers, Richard with his natural business acumen, James with his academic brilliance. I was just Mark. The one who was good with people. The one who could fix things. The one who stayed. Our parents divorced when I was 12. Mom moved to Florida with her new husband, and we all chose to stay with Dad. He ran Reynolds Construction, a business his father had started, building it into a respectable mid-sized company. Dad wasn't flashy about his success. He lived in the same Crestmore neighborhood house he'd bought when he first married Mom, drove sensible cars, and taught us the value of hard work. No handouts in this family, he'd say. You want something, you earn it. Richard and James took that to heart in their own ways. By 30, Richard had started his own real estate development company, leveraging Dad's connections. James earned his MBA and moved into corporate finance. I went to college for business like they did, but halfway through my second year, Dad had his first heart attack. I still remember the hospital room, the beeping machines, the 2 bright lights, and Dad looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I'll be fine, son, he'd assured me. Just a warning shot across the bow. Need to eat better, that's all. But I saw something in his eyes that my brothers missed, fear. Not of dying, but of being alone when it happened. That night, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I transferred to the University of Colorado Denver to be closer to home and started working part-time at Reynolds Construction. Richard was furious when I told him. You're throwing away your future to babysit Dad. He doesn't need you hovering around him. He needs us to be successful. James was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. It's admirable, Mark, but unnecessary. We can hire people to check on him. But they didn't understand. It wasn't about checking on him, it was about being there. About Sunday dinners and Tuesday night baseball games. About knowing when his arthritis was acting up because he winced reaching for the remote. About being the one person he didn't have to pretend with. I finished my degree and took a full-time position at Reynolds Construction. Not in management like my brothers expected, they assumed Dad would give me a vice president title, but in project management. I wanted to learn the business from the ground up, to understand what made it tick beyond the balance sheets and investor meetings. Dad respected that, even if my brothers didn't. Mark's found his calling as Dad's assistant, Richard joked at a family barbecue when I was 32. Some people aim for the stars, others aim for job security. At least someone in this family has practical skills, Dad had responded, but Richard just laughed it off. The pattern was set early. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who would drop everything when family called. When Richard's first marriage imploded, I was the one who helped him move into his new condo while he was too busy closing deals. When James's son was diagnosed with severe asthma, I was the one who researched specialists and drove them to appointments while James was at conferences. I didn't mind. Family meant everything to me, and I believed they'd do the same for me. When I married Sarah at 34, they all came to the wedding, though Richard brought client contracts to review during the reception and James left early to catch a flight. Sarah understood me in ways my brothers never did. She was a kindergarten teacher who valued connection over achievement, kindness over accolades. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in Hampton, not as prestigious as my brother's Cherry Creek addresses, but comfortable and within our means. You could afford better if you'd asked Dad for that VP position, Richard pointed out when he first visited. This neighborhood is quaint. We like quaint, Sarah had replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We tried for children for 7 years before the doctors confirmed what we feared, it wasn't going to happen for us. Instead of the family we dreamed of, we poured our love into our community, hosting neighborhood block parties, volunteering at Sarah's school, becoming the honorary aunt and uncle to dozens of kids. My brothers saw this as further evidence of my failure. No prestigious career. No lavish home. No children to carry on the Reynolds name. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was the richness of our life, the genuine connections we'd built, the respect we'd earned through generosity rather than achievement. Dad saw it, though. "You've built something worth having," he told me one night when he came over for dinner in my 43rd year. We were sitting on the back porch, watching fireflies dance over Sarah's garden. "Your brothers have acquired a lot, but I'm not sure they've built anything that will last." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I was too busy defending them, as usual. "They're just different, Dad. They're doing what makes them happy." He gave me a long look. "Are they? Are they really happy, Mark?" Before I could answer, Sarah called us in for dessert, and the moment passed. But his question lingered in my mind, especially as I watched my brothers over the following years. Richard's development company expanded rapidly, too rapidly, in retrospect. He was constantly chasing the next big deal, leveraging everything on increasingly risky ventures. His second marriage produced 2 children he rarely saw and ended in another expensive divorce. His third wife was 20 years his junior and seemed more interested in his black Amex than his company. James climbed the corporate ladder impressively but changed firms every few years, always in pursuit of a bigger title or bonus. His wife Caroline managed their social calendar with military precision, ensuring they were seen at all the right charity galas and country club events. Their 3 children attended the most exclusive private schools but spent most of their time with nannies. Meanwhile, Sarah and I lived our small life. I was promoted to operations manager at Reynolds Construction, overseeing project execution rather than chasing new business. Dad had stepped back from day-to-day operations by then, serving as chairman while a non-family CEO ran things. The arrangement worked well, the company remained profitable without the aggressive expansion Richard had always pushed for. Our family dynamic settled into a predictable pattern. Every month, we'd gather at Dad's house for dinner. Richard and James would dominate the conversation with tales of their latest triumphs, while Sarah and I listened and asked questions. Dad would nod and smile, occasionally catching my eye with a look I couldn't quite decipher. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for Sarah's diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The words fell like bombs in the sterile hospital consultation room when I was 48. 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. Sarah chose quality of life over a few extra painful weeks. We had 5 months together before she slipped away on a quiet Tuesday morning. I thought my brothers would step up then, would be there for me as I had been for them. Richard sent flowers and a pre-printed sympathy card. James called once, awkwardly offering financial advice about Sarah's life insurance policy before steering the conversation to his son's college prospects. Dad moved into our guest room for a month. He cooked meals I couldn't eat, sat with me through sleepless nights, and held me when grief cracked me open. He was 79 then, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but he somehow found the strength to carry us both. "I know what it is to lose your person," he said simply. He'd never remarried after Mom left, had never even dated seriously. The world keeps spinning, and that's the cruelest part. When he returned to his own home, our relationship had deepened beyond father and son. We were companions in loss, in understanding what really mattered. I found myself spending even more time with him, checking in daily, taking him to medical appointments, joining him for Rockies games even though neither of us cared much about baseball anymore. Richard noticed, of course. "Getting your name at the top of the will," he asked during a rare solo visit to Dad's house, finding me there fixing a leaky faucet. He made it sound like a joke, but his eyes were calculating. "Dad needed help," I replied simply. "The plumber he called never showed up." "We could hire a property manager for all this," Richard said, gesturing vaguely around the house. "Someone to deal with repairs, drive him to appointments, all that boring stuff. Free up your time." "For what?" I asked. He looked genuinely puzzled. "For living your life, Mark. You've got what, maybe 20 good years left. You want to spend them playing nurse?" I tightened the pipe fitting before responding. "This is my life, Rich. I'm exactly where I want to be. He shook his head, that familiar mixture of pity and condescension in his expression. Whatever makes you happy, little brother. Some people aim high, some aim low. At least you're consistent. The comment stung, as his barbs always did, but I let it go. What Richard never understood was that I wasn't aiming low, I was aiming at something he couldn't see or value. As Dad entered his 80s, both Richard and James became more attentive, or at least, more present. Their visits increased, often with financial documents in hand. Estate planning. Tax strategies. Investment restructuring. They were preparing for the inevitable, positioning themselves. I noticed other changes too. When the three of us were together with Dad, they'd exchange glances I couldn't interpret. Conversations would halt abruptly when I entered rooms. Dad became more withdrawn after their visits, more thoughtful. Everything okay? I asked him after one such visit, when I found him staring out the window at his garden. Just thinking about legacy, he said. About what we leave behind that matters. The company is in good shape, I assured him. The succession plan is solid. He turned to me with a sad smile. I'm not talking about the company, son. Before I could ask what he meant, his housekeeper announced dinner was ready, and the moment passed. But that phrase, what we leave behind that matters, echoed in my mind over the following weeks. The last family dinner we had together was for Dad's 84th birthday. Richard and James both attended with their current wives, all smiles and designer outfits. Richard brought an expensive bottle of scotch that Dad couldn't drink because of his medications. James presented a leather-bound first edition of Dad's favorite Hemingway novel, a thoughtful gift that might have meant more if Dad's eyesight hadn't deteriorated to the point where reading was nearly impossible. I brought a digital photo frame loaded with hundreds of family photos dating back to Dad's childhood, including many of Mom that I'd scanned from old albums. I'd set it to play his favorite jazz as the images transitioned. When he opened it, tears welled in his eyes. "This is perfect, Mark," he said softly. "This is exactly right." Richard rolled his eyes when he thought no one was looking. James checked his watch. Their wives made polite conversation while glancing at their phones. Only Dad and I seemed fully present in the moment. After dinner, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I overheard Richard and James talking on the patio. I wouldn't have listened, but I heard my name. "Mark's going to be a problem when the time comes," Richard was saying. "You know he expects an equal share." "Dad's always had a soft spot for him," James replied. "The perpetual underachiever who needs looking after." "We've built something from nothing," Richard continued. "All Mark's done is hold Dad's hand and play the devoted son. That's not worth a third of the estate." "I've spoken with Howard," James said, referring to Dad's longtime attorney. "The plan is solid. Mark will get the house and a stipend. Enough to keep him comfortable but not enough to cause problems." "Good," Richard said. "He wouldn't know what to do with real money anyway. Probably donate it all to some orphan kitten charity." They laughed then, a familiar sound that had echoed through my childhood, my brothers united, always a step above me, always in control. I quietly set down the plate I'd been drying and stepped back from the kitchen door. My hands were shaking, not with anger but with a profound sense of disillusionment. All these years, I'd told myself they respected me in their own way, that beneath the teasing was fraternal love. Now I knew better. I finished the dishes mechanically, said my goodbyes, and drove home to my empty house. I didn't confront them. I didn't call Dad. I sat in my darkened living room until dawn, reassessing every interaction, every family gathering, every backhanded compliment through this new lens of understanding. The next morning, Dad called. "Can you come over today?" he asked, his voice sounding older than usual. "There's something I need to discuss with you." "Of course," I said, pushing aside my own turmoil. "I'll be there in an hour." I didn't know then that this visit would change everything, that the conversation I was about to have with my father would upend the family dynamics forever. I didn't know that within 3 months, Dad would be gone, and the true nature of his legacy would be revealed. I just knew that something felt off, had felt off for longer than I cared to admit. And I was finally ready to see it clearly. When Dad asked me to come over that morning, I expected the kind of conversation we'd had a dozen times in the last few years, discussing the next contractor for the porch, whether to change his hearing aid batteries more often, if he wanted me to bring over the lemon bars from the bakery on the corner. Those conversations were the scaffolding of our days, ordinary, intimate, full of small acts of care that felt, in aggregate, like a life built steady and true. What I didn't expect was betrayal printed on heavy, lawyer-grade paper. His kitchen smelled like coffee and the cold air that hangs in Denver in early November. The light through the dining room windows had the milky quality winter brings, soft and unforgiving. Dad sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders a little more slumped than they'd been the week before, pills in a plastic pillbox beside his cup. He waved me to the chair opposite him. "Glad you came," he said. There was a fatigue in his voice that had nothing to do with his medications. I started to reply, but my eye caught the stack of papers fanned out on the island in front of him. The top sheet had Howard and Associates letterhead. Underneath, in that plain, bureaucratic font, a title, Proposed Amendment to Last Will and Testament, Reynolds Family Trust. I felt my mouth dry. I did what millions of husbands or children do when they find an unexpected bill or a letter from the IRS. I read the important parts first. The amendment listed beneficiaries. Richard and James's names were printed in bold. My name was there too, but only in a clause about a life-sustaining stipend and residence, and language about maintenance and medical necessity. The percentages were skewed, the bulk of the estate, the company shares, the investment accounts, everything that mattered, was allocated to my brothers. Beneath the amendment were other things that could not be dismissed as clerical minutiae. There were photocopies of emails. Many of them were between Howard and Richard, dates, times, curt sentences about ensuring competency is documented and arranging for hospital witness. One email from James read like a shopping list: get nursing evals, get doc signatures, schedule appointments when Mark is unavailable. Another was a printout of a voicemail Richard left on Howard's phone: we need this done discreetly. Make it look sensible. I hadn't known I could feel two kinds of hurt at once, one like a hot brand, one like a slow, cold erosion. The brand was the realization that they had been scheming openly, using the law to rearrange our father's legacy as if it were a boardroom transaction. The erosion was the memory of Sunday dinners and the ways they'd threaded through our lives, how many times I'd run interference, loaned money, fixed cars, ported their kids between soccer practice and piano lessons. They had been using me as safety net and scrim for their ambition, and behind the scenes they were building contingency plans to shut me out when the time came. I left the papers where they were and walked to the sink like I was sleepwalking. My hands moved through the motions of cleaning a mug. Cleaning is mechanical, it keeps you from doing anything you might regret in a panic. Dad watched me without saying anything. After a long moment, I put the sponge down. Did Richard and James know about this? I asked. My voice sounded small in the bright kitchen. Dad's eyes filled with that familiar sadness I knew how to read by now. He had always been a man who kept his moral life tidy in a way my brothers never did. They've been talking to Howard for months, he said. They think the company should go to them. They told me it would be better for Reynolds Construction. Said it would protect the jobs. Said a lot of things. You let them on the board. The words were sharper than I intended. I never let them anywhere, he said. They kept coming to me when they thought I was tired. When I was in the hospital, they were very persuasive. They told me things were more complicated than they were. They wanted to make things practical. I told them I didn't want a fight in the family, Mark. He looked small in that moment, not from age but from the weight of having to balance love and disappointment. There was a tiny fold between his brows I hadn't noticed before. I thought I could handle them. I thought I could manage it. It was then the last, quiet betrayal took root. This wasn't just greed, it was a conspiracy built on the idea that their ends justified undignified means. They were going to use Howard to create the circumstances that legally stripped me of the things that could matter in my life, my livelihood, my dignity, my home, while writing me a line that would make it appear they'd been reasonable. I left his house composed enough to drive, but my insides were a riot. I called a number I had in my contact list, not a lawyer, not yet, but Louise McKenna, the accountant who'd kept Dad's books for 30 years and who had known every crooked promissory note and misfiled tax form the Reynolds family had tried to gloss over. Louise, I said, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. Have you seen any proposed amendments for Dad? Anything regarding his will? I found something. There was a long exhalation on her end. I was afraid of this, she said finally. I got a call from Howard a few weeks ago saying he was meeting with Mr. Reynolds about some updates. I assumed. I don't know, I assumed he meant sensible estate planning. But with Richard and James pushing, she stopped, as if the rest needed no spelling out. She had always been more blunt than Howard, which is why she was exactly the person I needed right then. Can you come by tonight? I don't want to tip them off. If they're being discreet, they'll be clever about it. My calendar's open, she said. Bring that paperwork. I put the documents in a manila folder and slid it into my car under the passenger seat. The city moved around me, oblivious, a school bus clanged, a jogger in a neon jacket pounded past, a storefront heater coughed warm breath onto the sidewalk. The ordinary life of Denver kept spinning while the center of mine had shifted. That afternoon, I began to plan, not audacious, cinematic revenge, but a careful, legal kind of defense. Revenge in a family was a dirty thing. You could destroy people without losing money, and you could leave wounds that wouldn't heal. I didn't want to ruin anyone. I wanted fairness. I wanted to make sure that if the estate was contested, the outcome would not be a puppetmaster's victory achieved in the shade. Step 1, get the paperwork. I photographed every document with my phone because paper disappears, but pixels persist. I made a checklist of everything relevant, emails, drafts of the will, dates of meetings, times of hospital stays. If a claim of undue influence were ever raised, the record of when and how Richard and James had been pressuring Dad would be crucial. Step 2, verify competency. I called Dr. Amini, Dad's neurologist, and asked a blunt question. When was the last cognitive assessment? The doctor's response was careful and clinical. We've been monitoring memory and decision-making. Mr. Reynolds is somewhat forgetful but not disoriented. He retains his legal capacity. But if there's a concern, we can do a formal capacity exam. That last sentence was important. If they were trying to manufacture incapacity, bring in a doctor who would sign off on an evaluation designed to make Dad look incompetent, then a baseline, a signed, dated assessment from someone independent could be a powerful counter. I scheduled it for Tuesday. Step 3, secure an alternative counsel. Howard's office had been the Reynolds family's go-to for decades, too cozy. I needed someone with a reputation that made Howard's little maneuvers look clumsy by comparison. I called Eleanor Price, a probate lawyer at a firm downtown who had once saved a client from a similarly unscrupulous sibling-in-law. I had met her years ago at a board meeting. She had a way of speaking that made people believe in precedence and decency. Mr. Reynolds, she said when I introduced myself. There was the faintest skepticism in her voice, the way someone reserves judgment until facts are presented. I cannot take a case based on gossip. Bring me the documents. Bring me dates. If there is evidence of undue influence, we can act. You will need to be methodical. Her tone could have been icy if it weren't so precise. I liked that. Methodicalness suits me. Will you do it pro bono if it's about protecting an elder from predatory family maneuvers? I asked. She hesitated, then said, no. But I will take a retainer that looks like a regular estate planning fee. We do not like family fights, Mr. Reynolds. But we like fairness more. Step 4, slow their access. This was where my years at Reynolds Construction paid off. I had friends in the company who owed me favors. Vince Caldwell, the CFO, had been on the phone with me within an hour of my text. If there's any attempt to change signatories or push through transfers, Vince said, I can put a freeze on authorization changes for 30 days. I'll need something formal, but I can buy you time. Time. That was the currency I collected like coins in a jar. The longer I could keep them from moving assets, the more opportunities there would be for Dad to sign something unequivocal, for legal counsel to draw lines, for truth to be recorded. It wasn't all wins. There were setbacks that same week, small, stinging, reminders that I wasn't the only one paying attention. Howard scheduled a meeting with Dad 3 days before the neurologist's appointment, under the pretense of clarifying administrative records. Richard drove Dad home from the meeting with a smile, and when I asked about it later, Dad waved it off with a joke about the weather. At the meeting, it was likely that Howard attempted to frame the conversation to look like standard housekeeping, not the orchestration I'd seen on paper. I called Eleanor and told her about the meeting. Do not let him go to any more appointments alone, she said. If you can persuade your father to have a neutral witness present for every legal discussion, that will help. Also, get every electronic device, phones, tablets, collected and backed up. Emails and texts will tell you everything. Dad uses emails? I asked, incredulous. In my mind, he was still the man who wrote checks and called by landline. He does, Louise said later, when she was sitting at my kitchen table going through the pages with a fine-toothed comb. And so do your brothers. People underestimate how much digital paper trails reveal. See this? She tapped a printed email thread where Richard suggested a date for a casual chat with Dad, then followed up 2 lines later with, if Mark is there, we pivot. It was petty and surgical all at once. That night, after Dad went to bed, I sat at my computer and set up a folder titled Reynolds Defense. The label felt like a small act of treason, and I resented myself for thinking like a battleground commander. But this wasn't about me being dramatic. This was about preserving a man's dignity from being erased by his own sons. I began to assemble a chain of custody for the documents. Photos had time stamps. Emails had headers. The neurologist appointment was scheduled. Vince had put the authorization hold in motion with the company. Eleanor had agreed to prepare a letter to the banks and to file a notice that any sudden transfers should be scrutinized. Louise had already sent me a few supportive notes about what could be held in escrow and what couldn't. We were building a slow, legal dam. As I worked, I kept thinking of the little things, how Richard had once told Dad at a birthday that Mark will rot in that house forever, or how James had called me sentimental when I took a week off work to handle Dad's paperwork after one hospital stay. I had sheltered their lives from inconvenience. The rawness of the betrayal wasn't just that they wanted more, it was that they had been willing to manipulate the narrative to make the theft look like prudence. By the end of the week, we had a fragile web of protection, legal counsel retained, a formal cognitive test scheduled, a company hold in place, bank watch lists requested by Eleanor, and a backup of all important documents in my possession. I had also done something I hadn't expected, to put a camera on the porch. I hesitated before doing it. It felt voyeuristic. But Eleanor had advised a simple, legal measure, a visible camera can deter. It's not about spying on the family, it's about creating a record of who comes and goes. Make sure you tell your father about it. If he's uncomfortable, we remove it. If his sons are using the house as a corridor for influence, you'll be glad for the footage. Dad agreed begrudgingly when I showed him the camera. He patted my knee. I don't like cameras, he said. But I don't like being bothered either. Do what you need to do, son. The camera was installed and pointed at the driveway and front door, where visitors would be obvious. Small victory, Eleanor sent a crisp letter to Howard's office reminding them of their ethical obligations and warning of scrutiny if any will changes were rushed without proper assessments. Small victory, Vince confirmed that any requested changes to corporate signatories would now require board approval. Setbacks, of course, kept arriving like storm clouds that never quite delivered rain. Richard called that evening and asked to drop by to talk. I told him no. He came anyway and stood in the driveway looking small and composed, like a man who expected to be let in without invitation. I didn't invite him into the house. Mark, he said, as if surprise were a thing he was entitled to. We need to put aside whatever this is. Dad's getting frail. Family squabbles never look good. We'll talk when there's something to say. My voice was precise because I knew the odds of a calm family talk were as slim as the glass on my kitchen table. He left without raising his voice. I watched him go and something in me settled. I wasn't out to ruin people, I was out to make sure the record was true. If that meant letting my brothers come to me and have the world see them, unvarnished and unguarded, then I was prepared to do that. It felt, perversely, like justice. That night I slept fitfully. In my dreams I was back in the hospital with Dad, his fingers finding mine, and me promising him that I would be there. The vows I'd made as his son, the ones made without any need for witnesses or lawyers, suddenly had legal weight because other people had decided to challenge what they meant. I woke up convinced of one thing, when the storm hit, and it would, I wanted the watermarks, the timestamps, the witnesses. I wanted a trail that showed who had tried to manipulate a life and who had simply shown up. I had no illusions that the path ahead would be clean or quick. The betrayal had opened a map with many roads, some of them dark. But the thing about maps is they tell you where you can go. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was not wandering aimlessly on someone else's trail. I had a plan, small and practical, and a handful of allies who understood the law, the company, and the gravity of what I was trying to protect. I didn't know yet if those protections would be enough. I only knew, with a deep and terrible clarity, that I was no longer going to be the family safety net that others used on their way to taking everything. Not this time. Not when the consequences were larger than pride and more like a man's last years. So I did what I had always done when something needed fixing. I read the plans, lined up the favors, and started bolting the doors. The weeks following my discovery of the betrayal were a whirlwind of activity, strategy, and emotional turmoil. My mornings began with coffee and a review of the previous day's notes, meticulously documenting every conversation, every email, and every subtle maneuver by Richard and James. I was determined to ensure that no stone was left unturned in my quest for justice and fairness. My evenings were spent poring over legal documents with Eleanor and Louise, dissecting the intricate web of deceit my brothers had woven. Despite my meticulous planning, the tension at family gatherings grew palpable. Richard and James were visibly frustrated by my newfound assertiveness, and their thinly veiled attempts to regain control only fueled my resolve. They would arrive at Dad's house with forced smiles, making small talk while casting wary glances at me. I, on the other hand, remained composed, knowing that every interaction was a potential piece of evidence in the battle ahead. One evening, as we gathered for a routine family dinner, the atmosphere was particularly charged. Richard and James were discussing a recent real estate deal, their voices filled with the arrogance of success. Dad sat quietly, his gaze drifting between his sons and me, a mixture of pride and concern etched on his face. "Mark, how's the house holding up?" Richard asked, a hint of condescension in his tone. "Still no leaks, I hope." "It's fine, thanks," I replied evenly, resisting the urge to snap back. "I've been meaning to ask, though, how's the new development coming along? Heard you had some zoning issues." James shot me a wary look. "We're handling it. It's just a minor setback. Nothing we can't manage." "Good to hear," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Dad's been asking about it. He's always interested in how the business is doing." Dad nodded, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Yes, I do like to keep up with the boys' adventures. Keeps me young, you know." Richard and James exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. They knew I was onto them, and the knowledge gnawed at their confidence. As the evening wore on, their attempts to steer the conversation back to familiar, safe topics grew more desperate. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room, Richard made a pointed comment about the burden of estate planning. "It's a lot of work, you know. Making sure everything is in order. We've been trying to help Dad with it, but it's a complex process." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure you have. But it's important to make sure everything is fair and above board. Dad deserves that." James chuckled nervously. "Of course. We're just trying to make things easier for him. Less stress. And for yourselves, no doubt," I said, my voice laced with irony. "But I'm sure Dad appreciates your efforts." Dad looked between us, his expression unreadable. "I do appreciate all the help you boys give me. But it's important to remember that family is about more than just business. It's about trust and respect." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Richard and James shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading. I could see the realization dawning on them: they had underestimated me, and their carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. As the weeks passed, my strategy began to take shape. Eleanor had advised me to document everything, to create a clear and undeniable record of my brother's machinations. With her guidance, I compiled a comprehensive dossier, complete with emails, text messages, and witness statements. Louise helped me navigate the financial aspects, ensuring that any attempts to manipulate Dad's assets would be met with a firm and legal response. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence was a series of emails between Richard, James, and Howard, the family lawyer. In them, they discussed various strategies to manage Dad's estate, with a particular focus on minimizing my inheritance. "We need to ensure that Mark doesn't get more than he deserves," one email read. "He's never contributed much to the family business, after all." Another email outlined a plan to have Dad declared incompetent in order to gain control of his assets. "If we can get a doctor to sign off on it, we can handle everything without any interference," James had written. The emails were damning, revealing a cold and calculated plot to strip me of my rightful inheritance. With Eleanor's help, I presented them to Dad, who was horrified by what he read. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted my boys to fight over what I leave behind." "I know, Dad," I said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "But we have to make sure that your wishes are respected. That's what matters most." With Dad's blessing, we took the next step, filing a formal complaint with the probate court, challenging the validity of the proposed amendments to the will. Eleanor drafted a detailed affidavit, outlining the evidence of undue influence and the attempts to manipulate Dad's decisions. She also requested a formal competency evaluation, to be conducted by an independent neurologist. The legal battle that ensued was grueling, with Richard and James fighting tooth and nail to maintain their grip on the estate. They hired high-powered attorneys, who launched a series of aggressive counterattacks, attempting to discredit me and cast doubt on Dad's mental state. But I was prepared, armed with the documentation and the support of Eleanor, Louise, and a network of allies who had seen the truth. As the court proceedings dragged on, the family dynamics grew increasingly strained. Richard and James became more desperate, their once confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of the evidence against them. They made several attempts to reach out to me, offering compromises and settlements that would have left me with far less than I deserved. But I remained steadfast, unwilling to be bullied or coerced. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest legal filings, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "Mark, we need to talk. It's important. Please." I hesitated, then replied with a simple, "When?" He suggested meeting at a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown. I agreed, curious to see what he would say. The cafe was dimly lit, the air filled with the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries. Richard sat at a corner table, his usual air of confidence replaced by a nervous energy. He stood as I approached, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I know things have been tense." "They have," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What do you want to talk about?" He took a deep breath. "Look, Mark, I know we've been at odds. But I didn't want it to come to this. I didn't want us to be fighting over Dad's estate like this. It's not what he would have wanted." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because it sure seems like you and James have been working hard to make sure I get as little as possible." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it looks bad. And maybe some of the things we did were questionable. But we were just trying to protect the family business. To make sure it stays in good hands." "By cutting me out entirely?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "By trying to declare Dad incompetent?" "That's not protection, Richard. That's theft." He looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I know. And I'm sorry. I didn't realize how far things would go. James, he pushed for a lot of it. I went along because I thought it was the right thing to do. But I see now that it wasn't. It was wrong. I studied him, searching for any sign of sincerity. So what do you want? A truce? A settlement?" "I want to make things right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to ensure that Dad's wishes are respected. That you get what you deserve. I'll talk to James. We'll work something out." I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. "And what about the legal battle? The court proceedings?" He shook his head. "We'll drop them. We'll admit that the will amendments were invalid. We'll agree to a fair division of the estate." I took a moment to absorb his words, weighing the sincerity of his apology against the years of betrayal. "All right," I said finally. "But it has to be more than just words. I need to see actions. And I need to know that Dad is protected." He nodded, relief flooding his features. "You will. I promise." As we left the cafe, I felt a mixture of emotions, relief, anger, and a strange sense of closure. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I had stood up for myself, for Dad, and for what was right. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, I knew that I was no longer the family failure they had always portrayed me to be. I was a son who had fought for his father's legacy, and I would continue to do so, no matter what. 3 days after my meeting with Richard at the cafe, Dad passed away in his sleep. The call came at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. His housekeeper found him peaceful in his bed, the digital photo frame I'd given him still cycling through decades of family memories on his nightstand. I drove to his house in the pre-dawn darkness, my hands steady on the wheel even as my heart shattered into pieces. Richard and James arrived within the hour, their faces masks of appropriate grief. We stood in Dad's bedroom, 3 sons united momentarily by loss, the morning light filtering through curtains he'd refused to replace since Mom left. For a brief moment, the battles and betrayals fell away, leaving only the hollow ache of absence. "He looks peaceful," James said quietly. "He does," I agreed, touching Dad's still hand one last time. Richard cleared his throat. "We should call Howard. Start making arrangements." And just like that, the moment of unity fractured. Even in death, Dad was still a chess piece in their game. The funeral was held at Fairmount Cemetery on a crisp November afternoon. The turnout surprised even me, hundreds of people whose lives Dad had touched through Reynolds Construction, through quiet acts of kindness, through simply being the kind of man who remembered names and asked about grandchildren. I gave the eulogy, speaking about integrity and the true measure of a man's worth. Richard and James sat in the front row, their expressions unreadable. The will reading was scheduled for the Monday following the funeral. Howard's office had the austere atmosphere of a place where fortunes changed hands and families fractured. Richard and James arrived early, accompanied by their attorneys. I came alone, carrying only a leather portfolio Dad had given me years ago. Howard, to his credit, looked uncomfortable as we assembled around the conference table. He'd been the Reynolds family attorney for 3 decades, but something in his demeanor suggested he knew this would be his last act in that capacity. "Before we begin," Howard said, adjusting his glasses, "I need to inform you that Mr. Reynolds made some changes to his estate planning in recent weeks. These changes were made with full mental capacity, as certified by Dr. Amini, and were witnessed by Eleanor Price of Price and Associates." Richard's jaw tightened. James leaned forward. "What kind of changes?" Howard opened a folder and withdrew a document. "Mr. Reynolds executed a new will 2 weeks before his passing. This will supersedes all previous versions and amendments." The room fell silent. I watched my brothers' faces as Howard began to read. "I, Harold Matthew Reynolds, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The standard legal language gave way to specifics. "The house in Crestmoor, to me. The cabin in Vale that had been in the family for generations, to me. The classic car collection Dad had painstakingly restored, to me. But those were just the beginning. Regarding Reynolds Construction and all associated assets, holdings, and intellectual property," Howard continued, his voice growing quieter, "I leave the entirety to my son, Mark Harold Reynolds." Richard shot to his feet. "That's impossible. The company is worth approximately $47 million, Howard finished. Yes, Mr. Reynolds was quite aware of the valuation. James's face had gone pale. "This is fraud. Mark manipulated him. We had agreements. Which were never executed," Howard said firmly. "And which Mr. Reynolds explicitly revoked in this will. If I may continue." He turned to the next page. "To my sons Richard and James, I leave the sum of $1 each, to be divided equally between them. This is not done out of malice, but to acknowledge that they have already received their inheritance through the advantages, connections, and opportunities one provided throughout their lives. They built their success on the foundation I laid, and that was their portion." The words hung in the air like a verdict. But Dad wasn't finished. Howard continued reading. "To Mark, who measured success not in dollars but in presence, who valued connection over acquisition, who stayed when others fled, you were my true legacy. You understood what I spent a lifetime learning, that wealth means nothing without wisdom, and prosperity is empty without purpose. Use these resources to continue what we built together, not just in business but in community." Richard's attorney was already on his phone, presumably researching grounds for contest. James sat frozen, his fingers white where they gripped the table edge. But there was one more surprise. "Additionally," Howard read, "I have established a charitable foundation in the Reynolds name, with an initial endowment of $10 million. Mark shall serve as the sole trustee, with the mandate to support families facing medical hardship, particularly those dealing with cancer treatment costs. This foundation shall be known as the Sarah Reynolds Memorial Fund. I felt tears sting my eyes. Even in his final act, Dad had remembered my Sarah, had honored her memory in a way that would help others facing the same battle we'd lost. "This is illegal," Richard snarled, his composure finally cracking. "We'll contest every word." Mark turned him against us. "We have evidence." "Evidence of what?" Eleanor Price entered the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Evidence that you attempted to manipulate an elderly man into disinheriting his son. Evidence that you conspired to have him declared incompetent when he showed signs of independent thinking. Because I have that evidence, gentlemen. Emails, recordings, witness statements. Would you like me to present them to the probate court?" The color drained from both my brothers' faces. Their attorneys exchanged worried glances. Eleanor continued, her voice sharp as winter wind. "Mr. Reynolds was examined by 3 independent physicians in his final weeks. All certified his complete mental capacity. He executed this will in the presence of multiple witnesses, including myself, 2 nurses, and a judge who happens to be a family friend. Every legal requirement was exceeded. Every safeguard was in place." She placed a thick folder on the table. "This contains copies of your correspondence regarding your plans to manipulate the estate. It also contains affidavits from Reynolds Construction Board members expressing concern about your attempts to raid the company's assets for your personal ventures. Would you like to proceed with a legal challenge, knowing this will all become public record?" The silence stretched like a taut wire. Finally, James spoke, his voice hollow. "No." Richard looked at his brother in disbelief. "James." "No," James repeated more firmly. "It's over, Richard. We lost." They left without another word, their attorneys trailing behind like shadows. Howard excused himself shortly after, muttering about needing to transfer files to new counsel. I sat alone in the conference room with Eleanor, the weight of what had just happened settling over me like snow. "Your father was a smart man," Eleanor said softly. "He knew they would come after you when he was gone. Every provision in that will was designed to be legally bulletproof." "When did he know?" I asked. "He suspected for months. But seeing those emails you found confirmed it. He was heartbroken, Mark. Not angry, just profoundly sad that his sons had lost their way. I thought about that last birthday dinner, about the tears in his eyes when he opened my gift. He'd known then. He'd known and still loved them, still hoped they might choose differently. The months that followed were a study in contrasts. I moved into Dad's house, unable to bear the thought of it standing empty. I kept his office exactly as he'd left it, down to the half-finished crossword puzzle on his desk. Reynolds Construction continued to thrive under my leadership, not through aggressive expansion but through steady, reliable work and fair treatment of employees. The first time I walked into a board meeting as owner, I expected resistance. Instead, I found relief. "Your father built this company on integrity," Vince Caldwell told me. "We're glad to see it staying in the hands of someone who understands that." Richard's real estate empire began crumbling within 6 months. Without the safety net of family money, without the Reynolds name opening doors, his leveraged deals collapsed one by one. He declared bankruptcy just before Christmas, his 3rd wife filing for divorce the same week. He called me once, drunk, at 2 in the morning. "You destroyed me," he slurred. "You turned Dad against us." "No," I said quietly. "You destroyed yourself. Dad just stopped enabling it." He hung up. We haven't spoken since. James lasted longer, his corporate position insulating him from immediate consequences. But word travels in Denver's business community. The story of how he tried to cheat his brother, manipulate his father, it followed him like a shadow. He was passed over for promotion after promotion, eventually accepting a lateral move to a satellite office in Detroit. His Christmas card this year included a brief note, "I'm sorry for everything. Maybe someday we can talk. Maybe someday we will." The Sarah Reynolds Memorial Fund has helped over 200 families in its first year. I review every application personally, remembering the crushing weight of medical bills, the impossible choices between treatment and financial survival. Last month, I received a letter from a woman whose daughter is now in remission, thanking the fund for covering the experimental treatment her insurance denied. She included a photo, a little girl with Sarah's same gentle smile, building a snowman in her front yard. I keep that photo on my desk, next to one of Dad and me at his last birthday dinner. The house feels different now, filled with the ghosts of conversations and choices. Sometimes I walk through the rooms and hear echoes, Dad's laughter, Richard's dismissive comments about my quaint little life, James checking his watch during family dinners. But mostly, I hear Sarah's voice, reminding me that kindness is never wasted, that showing up is its own reward. People ask if I'm happy with how things turned out. It's a complicated question. I never wanted my brother's destruction, I wanted their respect. I never wanted sole control of Dad's legacy, I wanted fairness. But life rarely delivers what we want in the packages we expect. Am I satisfied? When I see Reynolds Construction employees at their kids' soccer games instead of working unpaid overtime, yes. When the memorial fund helps another family navigate the nightmare of cancer, yes. When I sit in Dad's garden, now my garden, and watch the sun set over the mountains, yes. But satisfaction comes with shadows. Every success is tinged with the knowledge of what it cost, not in money but in family. Every holiday is a reminder of empty chairs and unbridgeable distances. Richard and James weren't just my brothers, they were my childhood companions, my reference points, my competition and my connection. Losing them, even to their own choices, carved out pieces of my history. Last week, I found a box of old photographs in the attic. The three of us at various ages, building a fort, dressed for Halloween, standing proud at high school graduations. In every photo, you can see it, Richard's confidence, James's intensity, and me, always a step behind, always trying to keep up. I no longer try to keep up. I've learned that my pace, slow and steady, leads to different destinations, quieter ones, perhaps, but no less meaningful. The money changes things, of course. Not in the ways my brothers imagined, no sports cars or vacation homes or country club memberships. But in smaller ways, the ability to hire the best home health aides for elderly neighbors, to quietly pay off medical debts for Reynolds Construction families, to ensure no employee ever has to choose between caring for a dying parent and keeping their job. Power, I've learned, isn't about what you can acquire, it's about what you can prevent. The power to prevent suffering, to prevent injustice, to prevent the kind of calculated cruelty my brothers showed to both Dad and me. Sometimes I dream about parallel universes, ones where Richard and James chose differently, where we remained brothers in more than blood. Where Sunday dinners continued with laughter instead of calculation. Where Dad's final years were spent in peace rather than protection. But you can't live in parallel universes. You can only make peace with the one you're in. Tomorrow marks 1 year since Dad's passing. I'll visit his grave, as I do every Sunday, and tell him about the company, the foundation, the lives touched by his legacy. I'll tell him that Richard's son reached out last month, tentatively, asking about summer work at Reynolds Construction. That James's daughter sent a thank you note for the college fund I quietly established for her and her siblings. The next generation doesn't need to carry the sins of their fathers. Dad taught me that. As I write this, snow is beginning to fall outside Dad's office window, my office window now. Denver winters are harsh but beautiful, blanketing the city in temporary perfection. By morning, the world will look different, cleaner, full of possibility. I think Dad would appreciate the metaphor. He always said that money was like snow, it could bury you or offer a fresh start, depending on how you handled it. My brothers let it bury them, convinced that accumulation was the same as achievement. I'm trying to use it for fresh starts, for others, for the family we might still salvage, for the man I'm still becoming at 54. The phone rings. It's Eleanor, calling about a new case, siblings fighting over an estate, another family tearing itself apart for money. She wants to know if I'll speak to them, share my story, maybe help them see another way forward. I agree, because that's what you do with hard-won wisdom, you share it, hoping others might avoid your pain. As I hang up, I catch my reflection in the window, superimposed over the falling snow. I look like Dad now, same thoughtful eyes, same slight stoop to the shoulders. But also different. Harder in some ways, softer in others. A man who learned that sometimes the only way to save your family is to let parts of it go. The snow continues to fall, covering Denver in its temporary grace. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to honor the legacy I never expected to carry alone. But tonight, in the quiet of the house that holds so many memories, I'm at peace with the truth Eleanor helped me see all those months ago. The real inheritance was never the money. It was the knowledge that I had been seen, truly seen, by the one person whose opinion mattered most. Dad knew who I was, not the failure my brothers portrayed, but the son who understood that wealth without wisdom is poverty of the worst kind. And that, more than any fortune, is enough. Thank you for spending your time with my story. Feel free to share your thoughts or reactions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.